Hi, everybody. So this week we're combining two different topics, the anthropology of kinship and the anthropology of science. So I'll go through kinship first and then science afterwards. Here's the overview. With kinship, Yo Mama actually is a social construct. That's because kinship, which is another way of saying family structure, is a social construct. The ways we imagine who is our family and who is not our family is socially constructed. This also means that because family structure varies so much cross-culturally and over time, that there is no such thing as a traditional family to the human species. Now, that said, you should still respect your mama, because just because it's socially constructed doesn't mean that those social relationships aren't real. With science, I'm going to go through a critique of objectivity. We're often taught in high school and middle school and elementary school to try to be objective, but there's some serious problems once you get to the college level with that whole framework that get really messy. And part of the reason I'm going to critique that in order so that we can start thinking about the way science and even scientific facts are produced within human interactions and social systems, and the way that research is shaped by our cultural assumptions. And this is going to get us at questions of scientific literacy, because how do we balance that science is socially constructed with also a commitment to intellectual rigor, to a commitment that not everything is equally true? So how do we find that middle ground? So starting with kinship, family structure varies cross-culturally tremendously. Early anthropologists were really interested in family structure. This is an old topic in anthropology because when you look at societies across the world, and particularly societies in which state power has not reached, it's not like kind of as it's not reaching as deeply into people's lives. For example, in remote, that's the wrong word to use, sorry, but like in environments where people, like for example, Hmong people went, where there's an active effort to seek out environments that are you're less likely to face like state interference. Um, one of the primary things that organize the society in those concepts is who you're related to. That family is a major form of social organization. And so early anthropologists came up with tons and tons of language for describing these variations. And I'm going to talk through them because they're going to be important for making the claims, supporting the claims that I'm going to make and some of the, yeah, my goal isn't that you memorize all these words. These words are not going to be on the exam. It's rather just a way I'm trying to demonstrate this larger idea that family structure, that kinship is socially constructed. So one way that family structure varies is through what's called lineality. Lineality refers to how you count your family. Who do you consider your family versus not family? Some families are matrilineal, meaning you count your family through your mother's line, but not your father's line. And you can see this in the diagram, in which the matrilineal society, right, the highlighted things mark that you're counting your family through your mother's line, but those people on your father's line are actually not considered your family. That's considered someone else. Other families can be patrilineal, which is the reverse, or in other societies, families patrilineal, in which you count your family through your father's line, but not your mother's line. So, in a patrilineal society, your mother's brother is not related to you, is not part of your family. Your father's brother and your father's sister is. Now, in the United States, we practice something called bilateral kinship, which means we count family through both our mother's line and our father's line, right? We consider both of those lines to be part of our family. Now, there are certain things that we do think about patrilineal. For example, last names. You get your last name through your father's line. That is a patrilineal form of social organization, in that we don't get our last names from our mother's line, more often than not. Now, this is important, right? Because, so for example, in many Native American societies, I'll go with Creek because that's the example I'm familiar with. Many in Greek society, going back historically into, for example, the 17, 18, 1900s, Greek people practiced matrilineal forms of kinship. And in fact, most Native American peoples in North America are matrilineal, with the exception of a couple groups like the Shawnee, who are patrilineal. So in Creek societies historically, your mother's, you would get what you called your clan, your larger family idea through your mother's line. So if your mother was Wind Clan and your father was, I don't know, Panther Clan, you would be Wind Clan. You get your place in society through your mother's line. And your father, the person who impregnated your mother, is not necessarily someone who takes on a role that we would imagine in the United States as a father role. Um, the person who bones your mom is actually going to be more of similar in terms of the social role, would be more similar to the way we think of uncles often, in the sense that, like, it's an older person who you might have a kind of friendly buddy relationship. You might have a special relationship with this man, but he wouldn't necessarily be an authority. He wouldn't be an authority figure. He wouldn't tell you what to do. He wouldn't have that authority over you. On the other hand, your mother's brother would. So your uncle on your mother's side would have that level of authority over you. So that would be more similar to the role that we often think of as the father role. Now, just because a society is matrilineal doesn't mean it's matriarchal. That's an important distinction. In Greek societies, there were matriarchal power structures. For example, clans were largely headed by matriarchs, older grandmas primarily. There was a complicated political system in a lot of indigenous societies in the southeast where certain domains, like clan, was under the purview of elder women, whereas other kinds of things like trade and war and basically like society, what maybe you could call foreign relations, were part of a power structure that was primarily led by men. Of course, there's a lot of variation in these societies. There's a lot of people that move back and forth between these roles, but as an overall tendency. So this is important, right? The person who donated sperm is just that. He's not necessarily your father in this kind of matrilineal form of social organization. Now, some societies that are matrilineal practice, they're never patriarchal societies, because if you think about that word patriarch, that refers to the authority of the father specifically. However, many matrilineal societies are what's called, I want to say avonarchical, which means the authority resides in the uncles. So you can still, like, matrilineality, patrilineality, that's not the same thing as power structures, is basically what I'm saying. Those two things vary independently. There's also focality, which refers to whether societies that refers to when people get married, where do they take up residence? A matrifocal society, you take up residence in the wife's town or household. In a patrifocal society, you take up residence in the father's town or household. Historically, in the U.S., and still in many cases, we practice what's neolocality. When you get married, you create a new household. Now, that said, as the economic conditions of the United States shift, increasingly people start practicing, or people are increasingly moving away from neolocal um, family structures because it is it's more expensive to open a new household. Now, there's other terms we can use, clan and moiety. These refer to larger kinds of things. A clan is like a larger family that you have, but you may not actually know how you're related to people. So, for example, going back to historically in the Southeast, you could travel through the through Creek country, and if you're in Wind Clan, any village you go to, you can go to the compound of Wind Clan, and that's your family. You may never have met those people. You may not know how you're related, but that's your family. So clan actually forms an important political structure that moves across towns, across multiple villages and towns. Moiety is a term. Basically, a moiety refers to a society where you're either it's a split in half, right? You're from either moiety A or moiety B. And ultimately, what all of this has to do, and trigger warning here for incest, is all of this has to do with the taboos around who you can marry and who you can't marry, um, particularly in terms of cousins. That is the underlying logic of many of these systems. So we have what are called parallel cousins and cross cousins. Basically, a parallel cousin means we're going to keep the gender the same. It's going to be your father's brother's children or your mother's sister's children. That's a parallel cousin. Cross cousin means we're going to alternate gender. So it's going to be your father's sister's children or your mother's brother's children. Now, why this was historically so important to anthropologists is because if in many societies you are able to marry your cross cousins, because if you're, for example, in a matrilineal society, your mother's brother's children, remember your mother's brother's children, those kids are not going to be quote unquote his children in the way we usually think about it. They'll be the clan, they'll belong to the family of his wife. And your father's sister's kids are not your family because your father is not your family. Now, this can get really complicated and messy, as you can assume, right? So, for example, some of the elders I work with simultaneously are using both bilateral and matrilineal kinship systems at the same time. And it took me a long time to realize one of the elders I was talking to, when he talked about his daddy and when he talked about his father, those were two different people. One of them was his uncle. And so marrying your cross cousin is often considered acceptable in many societies. And we also see cousin marriage, for example, in aristocratic Europe because it's a really effective way of keeping wealth in the family. Um, yeah. And so in terms of the broader relevance of this and why I'm going so deep into it, I can explain that through an archaeological example. So, if you look historically at Mission San Luis in Spanish La Florida, this is a Spanish mission lived in by Appalachian people who are part of the larger Muskogee language family. They're not part of the Muskogee Confederacy, but closely related. Um, some people say that they are the people who ended up allying with the Spanish instead of the English, but that's just an oral history. Um, if you look at that site, so this is around 1633 to 1704, there were all of these conflicts and misunderstandings that happened between the Spanish government colonial officials and Appalachian indigenous communities. And one thing you see Spanish authorities writing about is this idea that Appalachian men were incapable of controlling their wives. So think about like Spanish patriarchal norms in the 1600s, right? And there you see these officials who are just so surprised because all of these men are coming up to them and saying, "Hey, my wife is cheating on me. Can you do something about that?" And they look at this situation and they're just like, "Whoa, these are not proper men." And they kind of ridicule this in the records and the written documents that they write. However, knowing what we know now about kinship, I can tell you Appalachian societies were matrilineal and matrilocal, meaning you set up residence in the wife's village. That means a woman's husband has no authority. He is a stranger in a new town or a new village, and he is not in a position of authority over the woman he married. At best, he could go to the people, if he wanted to talk to a man who is in a position of authority in that way, he would talk to his wife's brothers or uncles. And so going to a Spanish official, we can see as a particular kind of social change that's happening, where now there are new authority structures by virtue of Spanish colonialism in which Appalachian husbands seek to exercise control or influence in new kinds of ways to to respond to things like their wives cheating on them, which itself is a pretty new idea because most indigenous societies, and I'll come back to this, were not particularly monogamous. Now, in the United States, more and more over time, we're seeing a shift to a radically different form of social organization or family organization that has never before been seen on this planet, called the nuclear family. This is the model that the primary family unit is the parents and the children, and that's it. This is often contrasted with the extended family, which is the larger group of relatives. This is something that is not even across race and class and ethnicity and national status. For example, it's very common in working class communities to practice extended family structures because in an extended family, you have more people that you can share resources with. It's really adaptive to precarious economic systems. Again, this is why people increasingly today are moving back in with their parents because it's an adaptation to changing economic circumstances. Now, I love this graph here. This is old data, but it's from the 2002 census. And one of the things they found is that they measured like, okay, what's the traditional family? But that's not really well defined, but we know the traditional family is different from the other categories at least, which include dual income with children, meaning two people are married and both parents are working, dual income without children, and then other. And what I love about this graph is that the other category is 64%. That's the majority of households. So what this data tells us is primarily that the researchers' categories, the categories that they assume are relevant, are not actually, they don't actually speak to the majority of how people live. And all we know about this other category is there's a lot of them, and like that could mean anything. So for example, if you're living with a roommate, that's other. I would say probably most people in this class belong in that other category right now. It could be in living with extended families. It could be any number of things. But this is a great kind of moment of returning to that point of the strengths of ethnographic evidence, right? Is we can start thinking about, oh, what is happening that in the world today that doesn't fit into these researchers' categories and this idea of the traditional family. which accounts for only 7% within these particular metrics. And indeed, this is something really different. In many other societies, you're not, like here I would say, I'm June, or I'm Dr. Block. But in many other societies, I would say, I'm June Block, daughter of Martha Caldwell, daughter of Jane Odom, and so on. And that's who you are. You are not an individual, you are a member of a family. So this idea of the nuclear family is a really fascinating social construction. And we can see, for example, these if you've ever seen those stickers on cars, I found one of a single parent household, which I thought was fun. That's the other category, single parent households, other. It's a great example of how do people construct the idea of family through small practices like these stickers. How do we construct the idea of what is a quote unquote normal family through these stickers, even when that normal is not, in fact, the norm? Now, I'll just briefly go through Kath Weston's article. This is a really good chapter from her book. Kath Weston was actually one of my doctoral advisors, and so I studied under her, and she's just this really lovely, sweet old lady. She did her research and published her book. She published her book in the 90s, Families We Choose. And what this book was about is how people in LGBT communities form chosen families in the context of being disowned by biological families. And it's really a deep dive into how we construct what we learn about the social construction of kinship in the United States by looking at queer families. And she's important historically in anthropology because she's not the first person to do this, but this is a great example of a moment when anthropologists increasingly started looking at saying oh, hey, this idea that anthropologists are supposed to study quote unquote people from faraway cultures, that's itself rooted in colonial ideologies. We should move past that. And so the fact that she's studying queer communities in San Francisco and the larger area, that larger region, is controversial at the time. And she was actually told in grad school that this would be career suicide. Now that said, this is an extremely well-read and well-cited book at this point in time. She's actually a very prominent, well-known researcher within the field of anthropology. Now, what she learns, right, through this process is a couple key pieces, right? First of all, she's interested in these cultural metaphors that we use to think about family. For example, the metaphor of blood, that we have blood family or biological family. Her point is that's a symbol, that's a metaphor. Biology itself is a symbol that we use to organize, to legitimize a culturally specific and fundamentally non-biological form of social organization or family structure. And so we often have this opposition of chosen family versus blood or biological family. And we see this in queer communities too, right? Even what I said before, right? The idea that you form chosen families after being disowned by your biological family. We see how deeply these ideas permeate in our society. And so what she's going to look at is coming out stories as a speech genre. So we're back to the idea of speech genre. I'm keeping this in for those of y'all doing the linguistics project as well, because it's a great example. What do we learn from thinking about coming out stories as a speech genre? And again, because this is an older chapter, it could be interesting to think about how this has changed today, how this has changed in the world today. And one of the things that she finds is that through these kinds of storytelling social practices, as LGBT people tell each other their coming out stories, there are different ideas about what makes a good coming out story. There's different ways of constructing the drama, but also what people are doing is they're telling you a story about who they are as a person. Because it's not just gender identity or sexual identity that they talk about in these stories, it's family structure. And particularly the way family structure is tied to things like race, class, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So coming out stories are also about all of these things. It's a way of crafting, or what Paige West called self-fashioning an identity through storytelling. We tell stories about ourselves to create that image. And at the end of the chapter, she gives us this beautiful little like twist of the knife in the gut, where she really just like, this is the moment where she leverages her critique of the social construction of kinship in this social and historical context. And her argument is that, quote unquote, blood family, again, as I said, it's a cultural metaphor, so her argument is all family is chosen family. We know this because we learn from queer communities that many children are disowned for being queer. You could not be unchosen as a family member unless biological family was also chosen family. So on page 73, we see like erotic relations, bonds symbolized by blood prove terminable precisely because they are selectively perpetuated rather than naturally given. Blood family is not naturally given. It is socially constructed and it is chosen. And we know this because those relationships are also terminable. You can be disowned. And in queer communities, a really common response to this cultural phenomenon is to form what are called chosen families, or families that are, you build family of people in your community. What I think many straight people would refer to as friends, but it's in many ways closer than friends. It's family. It's like, this is not I'm not like, it should be taken literally. Like, your chosen family is your family. Now, there was also an optional podcast from Kim Tallbear and Adrienne Keene, two really prominent people in Indigenous studies and social science. Kim Tallbear is an anthropologist. She also has this blog where she calls it the Critical Polyamorous blog. This is a really interesting podcast to me. I don't, it's new for me to think about, and like, I haven't fully figured out how to integrate it into the larger lesson about kinship, but she's making this point, right, that for her practice of non-monogamy, of basically, dating and loving multiple people at a time, is rooted in her indigenous politics. And the reason for that, the explanation for that, is that because, like, if we think about kinship as socially constructed, and we go back to that example of the Appalachee, right, we see Europeans, colonists developing particular ideas about the gendered and family relationships of colonized peoples that were very hierarchical, right? And it is common for indigenous, it's common in settler colonists to create forms of government, forms of regulation that are geared at forcing indigenous peoples to adopt European-based family structures and gender structures. For example, boarding schools are a big part of that with gender. And even going back to that early kinship stuff, right? Even social evolutionists were thinking about this kind of stuff, right? Because the idea was that certain forms of family structure, bilateral monogamous relationships, was considered more civilized, whereas everything else was considered more primitive. And so here, Tallbear is giving us a glimpse into an indigenous set of politics that is about saying, hey, can we rethink those social evolutionist assumptions and start thinking about what it means to relate and to love to other human beings? And she talks about non-human beings. How do we rethink what it means to have pleasure with other human and non-human beings, which includes but is not limited to sexual pleasure? in a way that challenges these older colonial assumptions. Going down the bullet list, I already talked about how extended families can be quite adaptive in many class-based contexts. We can also think a lot about family structure and racism. For example, the way that stereotypes are used to advance racist ideologies. For example, particularly in the 90s and aughts, there were a lot of discourses, and you can still see these, right, about um, Black, Indigenous, people of color families as being deficient, having absentee fathers, da 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 da, like all of these kinds of ideas that were basically saying these are broken families. When we could alternatively look and say, oh, it's a different family structure. So, for example, if you are child services, I guess I should preface this by saying Indigenous peoples are overwhelmingly disproportionately targeted by family services uh, in terms of taking children and putting them up for adoption. This is an old practice that historically is actually rooted in specific policies that were geared at adopting indigenous children into white families to forcibly assimilate them. It still happens today, though, in spite of laws that are supposed to protect this from happening. But for example, we can see a very similar analogy to the Fat Pets article in that if you're a bureaucratic agent, you have these models of what a family is supposed to look like. And maybe the mother and father are not the primary caretakers. Maybe it's the extended family. But from a bureaucratic perspective, you may not be able to see that. And this is one aspect of the larger social dynamics that lead to things like, for example, like indigenous children are like something like, I want to say in Michigan, which has a high indigenous population, like 22 times more likely, last time I heard, to be seized by family services than white children. Oh, by the way, that practice does qualify as genocide within international law. It is genocide to take people from one family and put them into another family in a way that is about in a way that eliminates or works towards the elimination of that ethnic, religious, or racial group. There's also a lot of really interesting research being done in the anthropology of kinship today that looks at new policies and ideas about new policies and technologies. For example, how does in vitro fertilization impact the social construction of families? What about kinship and state policy? For example, China and the one child laws. How is kinship related to nationalism? For example, I was watching the election and there was this point where people said like, oh, the election is basically like America's family photo. So now family becomes a metaphor through which we imagine the possibility of something like America as this kind of abstract idea of millions and millions of people that I will never, never, ever meet or have any meaningful relationship with. And this is a good point to shift into the anthropology of science. And so I'll just leave you here with this idea, right? Sure, uh, I support the traditional family. Let's bring back cross-cousin marriage. Now, that's a joke. This idea of a family structure, anthropologically speaking, the idea of a traditional family or a normal family, it just doesn't carry out. It's not a thing we see on the level of actual human organization. We don't see it cross-culturally, and we don't see it throughout human history, nor do we even really see it today, or at any point in U.S. history. It is the idea of a traditional family is a mythology. It's an ideological structure. It's a form of social organization, but kinship itself is socially constructed. And anthropologists have been looking at that for nearly 150 years now. Okay, so shifting gears here into the anthropology of science. This is a kind of separate topic, but there's important and interesting parallels. Now, my point here is that we can look at scientific research as anthropologists. We can study science as a social activity, because science is human, and if it is human, it is by definition cultural. So we can think about things like what are the social institutions, and the institutional basis of how research is done? What are the practices? What are the assumptions? What assumptions do researchers hold that may be how do assumptions that researchers hold, influence the questions they think to ask or their findings? So here I'm saying that science is socially constructed. I'm even going to argue that facts are socially constructed. So how do we do that? And this is a question for y'all, right? How do we grapple with the social construction of knowledge, of science, of facts, while also acknowledging that not everything is equally true, that not everything is equally supported by the evidence? And this is important for scientific literacy, right? We want to look at scientific studies and think about them critically. For example, what's the supporting evidence? 99% of the time, policies are made based on studies with very minimal understanding of the supporting evidence. And as a result, those policies end up extrapolating these studies far beyond, and even fundamentally misinterpreting these studies far beyond what is reasonable in terms of the policy. A great example I think I gave y'all earlier in the semester is with studies of transgender peoples. If you look at the scientific literature on this idea of detransition that you hear so much about on the news, detransition means something fundamentally different in medical circles and scientific circles than what politicians are referring to. And so the studies are actually measuring something fundamentally distinct. And that's important. And we also want to think about the larger social context of the scientific research. For example, what does that example tell us about power and ideology and social organization? But also, researchers do have implicit assumptions that shape their research. What happens when you have a group of researchers that all share the same sociocultural assumptions? They all believe this, they have the same assumptions about what is normal and natural. That can have a really negative impact on scientific knowledge. It's like speaking to the choir. What's the word? You have like a little echo chamber. So both of these things can be true. Science is socially constructed, and not all claims are equally defensible. That is the heart of scientific literacy. Now, we're often taught about this idea of objectivity in school. You're taught you should be objective. You should have an objective view of the world. We want to think about objective facts. Even think back to the beginning of the semester when I had y'all read or listen to that podcast about Indigenous history in South Carolina. And the impression that many of y'all came away with, which makes sense based on your high school education, was that this was factual and neutral, which just surprised me because I read the same thing, I listened to the same podcast as being anything but neutral, and the facts themselves as being biased in particular ways based on particular power structures. So one way we can talk about this is that when we think about objectivity, it's supposed to be the view from nowhere. So I have Sauron here. The way we imagine what it means to be objective is that you're able to look at the world from nowhere in particular, almost like you're a disembodied eye floating above the world. The problem with this is that is not an objective description of reality itself. Human beings are just not floating eyes that watch the world from above. Some people, some social scientists and philosophers refer to this as quote unquote the God trick, right? It's the idea that we can have a view that is like God's view, watching from on high, watching from a place of omniscience. This is why I said earlier, right, that I actually think a lot of the cultural assumptions that inform science actually come from a specifically Christian theology, because this is a very different understanding of God than the one that I have. And ultimately, like you have this idea of like objectivity that is so deeply rooted in this image of God, but now man can occupy that position of viewing from on high. And I have this fucking shitposty diagram right here, which is really just illustrating the fundamentally non-objective nature of our very idea of objectivity, right? So in this, I have the scientist, the knower, the subject, who gazes upon the object that she is seeking to study, right? She looks upon that social interaction. I have my shark friend and I have my other person who are doing culture and being social, right? And the researcher is observing it from on high. And, I have like these stupid shitposty things of like as if there's an invisible force field between the two. Now, this is not the empirical reality. Humans do not exist in this fashion. Human beings exist within the reality. That is why, for example, in ethnography, we have to talk about the way our bodies as our primary research tool influence the research. Because the people we're studying are also going to be looking at us and making decisions and choices and assumptions about us. They're going to be thinking about us. Knowledge goes both ways. We're not really singular knowers, right? Knowledge is built in communities and social relationships. This is something that's important in the way I teach. I teach knowledge as something, it's actually not just content. It's something that happens in social relationships. It's about like even just as simple as things of who you listen to and who you don't. That's a function of social relationships. Who you think is authoritative and not. That's a cultural dynamic. So this idea of the kind of objective and separated, the person who knows from a distance, who knows without interacting with the world they seek to know, that it doesn't work for anthropology. It actually doesn't work very good for quantum physics either. And here's a good example of this, right? I have these 3D models that I put up, and this was a few years ago, so maybe this has changed. But I have a shark friend, right? There's a avatar of a shark person in PowerPoint. But you know what there isn't? Black people. There are some people who like are vaguely potentially like, I don't know, I guess could be like Asian. But that's about it, right? There are no brown people. So the very technology that I have to even express these ideas to you is itself shaped by our social systems, these kinds of social ideologies and assumptions and power structures about race and racism. I can't even communicate a critique of objectivity without relying on these complex social systems that shape and influence what I'm able to say and show you. And this is kind of the point that I'm drawing out. Everything is deeply enmeshed in social and cultural relationships at every level. Another way of thinking about this is human beings, no one exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in a vacuum, right? You can't hold something apart and put it in a vacuum. You can't say, like, I want to study, I don't know, I want to study the nuclear family. That's a terrible example. You can't say, like, I want to study this person. I want to understand what it means to be human, but I want to understand what it means to be human in the absence of any particular larger social context. What does it mean to be human in the abstract? The problem is humans don't actually exist in the abstract. We don't exist in a vacuum. We only exist in the world with bodies and in social relationships, which means any attempt to approach humans otherwise is fundamentally based on weird, I'm not saying that they're useless. They can be useful. They can have power to them, but they're based on fundamentally arbitrary sets of cultural assumptions. The very foundations of how we think about objectivity, how we think about truth, are themselves cultural. And the reality is never in the abstract. It's always in the concrete. That's why I've been hounding y'all all semester. What are the particularities of the social context? Because that's how people actually exist. Now for next class, y'all will read an article about the representation of eggs and sperm in human reproduction. That'll be a fun conversation that we will have. And just as a brief primer, the questions that this article is thinking about is how do our assumptions about gender, about men and women, influence both how human reproduction is represented in textbooks and the questions that scientists even think to ask, right? Because there's just going to be this assumption that the egg is passive and the sperm are active, but that's really rooted in our gender ideologies. And once you think to question those assumptions and actually ask if that's what's happening, it turns out it's not. The egg is not passive. And so the question here to think through as you read this article is going to be, how does this shape the facts that we repeat as if they were absolute truth, right? When we read something in a, for example, introductory biology textbook, we then come to think of that as true, and we often get upset when people try to challenge that truth. But we have forgotten that the reason we believe these things is because we saw them in a textbook one time, and that is not itself, and that's itself a larger social construction, that it's more complicated. And we can look at all of these kinds of different examples of how facts themselves are socially constructed. For example, I think I gave many of y'all the example earlier in the semester that in archaeology, our data is largely biased towards what have historically been thought of as men's activities: hunting, warfare, things like that. Because if you go back, particularly the further you go back in time, there's an assumption that what really matters is what men are doing. And so archaeologists literally dug places that they thought were more important, and that meant to them associated with the activities they assumed men were doing. After 150 years of doing that, we just have a lot more data on those things. We have more data on hunting and projectiles. And that shapes what conclusions we can even draw, right? So the data itself is socially constructed. The facts are socially constructed. And then there's also this New York Times article, I Won a World Championship and Some People Aren't Happy. This was written by a philosophy professor at College of Charleston. She left College of Charleston. It was pretty clear in the way that she left that it had to do with things like death threats she was getting and transphobic harassment that she was getting. But, she was also a championship winning athletic cyclist. And what this article does that's really good, without giving too much away, is she goes through this kind of set of debates and political issues that are happening in terms of, like, how do we regulate, about trans athletes. And one of the issues that she pulls out, and that's really important here, is there is simply no way to determine and restrict trans athletes that is not also going to impact cisgender women, because biological sex is so variable. For example, if you were to restrict on the basis of hormones, I bet most of the women in this class have higher testosterone levels than I do. And even if you are a professional athlete, just some women just naturally have very high testosterone levels. Some cis women are not going to fit within those standards, whatever standards you choose, because things just aren't black and white in society and in human biology. There's just not these clear lines. There's so much variation and gray area in any aspect. And so this is a problem that I want to leave y'all on, right? Because on the one hand, we can say science is socially constructed. Facts are socially constructed. But does that mean everything is true? Do we live in, as some people say, a post-truth society where truth no longer matters everything's socially constructed, so anything you say is equally valid. And, one way of thinking about this, right, is I remember back when a long time ago Trump had this thing about alternative facts. And I thought that was so interesting as an anthropologist because in many ways I am a scientist who specializes in what I would describe as alternative facts. I look for the facts that speak to who is left out of larger mainstream narratives. Think about Audre Lorde and the blank, right? I'm interested in how the facts that shape the stories we tell about ourselves as a species and a society are socially constructed. And I'm interested in looking at knowledge maintained in marginalized communities that help that provide alternatives, that provide alternative facts to rethink these things. And yet, there are also things that are mistruths. There are also things that are lies. Not everything anyone says is true. And often, this idea of alternative facts codes for a lie. It's a kind of linguistic code, a way of euphemizing a lie. And so, how do we balance these kinds of things, particularly in a world where people are increasingly very skeptical of scientific consensus, whether it's climate change, whether it's public health and pandemic, or any number of other things? How do we balance rigor, intellectual rigor, with also a recognition that science is a social activity, that it is shaped by our social systems and power structures in important ways? Because if we forget that fact, we're only going to be stuck repeating the socially constructed facts as if they were objective. And that was my issue with the way a lot of liberal circles responded to this idea of alternative facts. It was to reinforce that there's an objective singular truth. That, oh, if we need to say that alternative facts, like that's a code for lying or a code for a mistruth, then the response is to double down on like, no, science is real. And like that is, for me as a scientist, an incoherent statement. Science is real? Like, yeah, I mean, it's real in that human beings are really running around doing this stuff. But like, it's a set of ideas. Science is ideas. It's people, it's practices, it's resources moving through the world. It's people making knowledge in rigorous ways, but within particular systems of power and social systems. So that idea, that kind of liberal reaction, was actually, for me, just as problematic in its kind of reactionary political implications. And so I'll leave you there for today because I love leaving you with problems rather than answers, because problems demand thinking through, and the more you know, the more you realize all your answers are deeply, deeply, deeply imperfect. The more you know, the less you realize you know. So, good luck. Y'all have the rest of your lives to sort out that fucking problem.